Senate File 17 is legislation that would petition Congress to propose a constitutional amendment to overturn Supreme Court rulings, Citizens United and several others, basically making it clear, clarifying that corporations and other entities are not people and money is not free speech. This is something that I think there's a strong public will about. One of the folks who came and testified was a retired Minnesotan who, with his brother, when he heard the Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago, they decided as senior citizens they were going to walk across the country to raise awareness of this. I think last November there were 150 some communities around the country in the state of Montana that put on their ballot referenda questions about this, and every single one of them in every community passed, usually by overwhelming margins.
Excuse me, Senator Marty. Members have private conversation if they take them into the retirement room or out in the hall.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Marty.
And so this is a resolution to Congress pushing for a constitutional amendment. And in committee, in one of the committees, some of the discussion, I think Senator Newman questioned some of the language and encouraged take another look at it. I've talked with him and a number of others and came up with the A1 amendment, which I'd like to offer at this time.
Senator Marty moves to amend Senate File 17 as follows. Page 1, delete lines 20 to 23. And this is the A1 amendment.
Secretary, or on the amendment, I'm sorry.
Madam President, the substance of there were several changes the Revisor's Office Senate Counsel suggested, but the substantive one was taking the language on lines 20 to 23 where we talk about certain entities and we spell out some of them like corporations and LLCs and so on, and we would just be replacing that with any entity, any organization of one or more persons. In other words, we want to make it clear that it covers any organization, anything that's not human doesn't have the constitutional rights. All of these organizations, labor unions, businesses, everybody, have rights, but those are rights that are given to them under law, rights and obligations. They all have rights and obligations under law. This would not change any of that, but they would not be guaranteed the rights that the Constitution gives to the people of the United States. And I'd urge your support for the amendment and be happy to stand for questions.
Discussion of the A1 amendment. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Madam President. Members, when we were in committee, I think it was the Finance Committee, but I'm not sure, I did discuss with Senator Marty my concern over the word artificial in terms of describing the nature of the entities that he was trying to capture here. You know, it is my belief that the word artificial is pretty ambiguous, and that the language that Senator Marty now has in his amendment does a better job of defining the various entities that he is trying to capture in this amendment. That doesn't mean that I am in support of his bill, but I do believe, members, that the A1 amendment is a better definition of the entities that Senator Marty is trying to capture. Thank you, Madam President.
Further discussion of the A1 amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Opposed, no. Motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. Further discussion of Senate File number 17. Senator Westrom.
Madam President, I'd like to offer the A3 amendment.
Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Westrom moves to amend Senate File number 17 as follows. Page 1, line 17. And this is the A3 amendment.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, members, the A3 amendment is a balanced budget amendment also. I think there are a few important things that our Congress needs to get serious about taking care of. Senator Marty is bringing forth something he thinks is is important as a message to Congress and flexing the strength that we have as a legislature to at least try to impress upon them an issue to move forward with. A balanced budget on our federal level is also important for the future health of our state and citizenry. And so this amendment would just include that in there as well as a topic that they need to put forth a constitutional amendment. Hopefully they would just do it by adding a constitutional amendment. In the event that it would be a constitutional convention, which I am not an advocate for, I think the process of them just doing the amendment by ratification is a much more preferable way. But in the event it would be left to call for a constitutional convention, it would implement a date of revocation 4 years out, so we don't just have a request hanging out there for decades. And so I've had that inserted as a revocation after 4 years if something hasn't been done on that front. Hopefully that is not the case and they go through the process of ratification. But members, I think it's important that we send a message as a state, as elected officials in our state, that a balanced budget amendment is very important for our nation. And Congress should be operating like we have to operate in our state, which is balance a budget every year, make tough decisions, but don't put it on the backs of the future generations and our children and our grandchildren. Let's start making decisions on a balanced budget approach from that day forward, because we all know the financial ruin that could be occurring with the debt that's been piling up at our nation's level. And I would urge your support.
Discussion of the A3 amendment. Senator Marty.
Madam President, I have some concerns about the amendment. I'd like to first put the Senate under call for the balance of the proceedings on this bill.
The Senate is under call. Senator Marty.
Madam President, I move further proceedings on the roll call be dispensed with and the sergeant be instructed to bring in absent members.
On the motion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The motion prevails. The sergeant will bring in the absent members. Senator Marty.
Madam President, Senator Westrom, I agree with you about the need for balancing the federal budget. I think your amendment would actually cause more gridlock when you're requiring the U.S. Congress to get 3/5 majority of both houses. I think one of the concerns people have been expressing about the Senate, about the filibuster there with a 60% 3/5 margin, 60% or 3/5 margin required to do that, how that is added to the gridlock. I think that while I agree with you that they should be working to balance the budget, both sides have very different points of view, and in the end saying you're going to make a 60% requirement for them to end up with a budget any year is a call for gridlock, and I urge opposition to the amendment and request a roll call.
There'll be a roll call. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Madam President. Will Senator Westrom answer a question for me, please?
Senator Westrom, do you yield? Yes? Senator Westrom, do you yield to a question? Yes. Senator Newman.
Madam President, Senator Westrom, on line 12 of your amendment, it says that if Congress has taken no action by June 1st, 2007, the legislature of the state of Minnesota withdraws this resolution. Senator Westrom, does that mean that this particular amendment would remove the portion of Senator Marty's bill that calls for a new constitutional convention?
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, Senator Newman, my understanding is that is the case. I am going to ask council, as they had it drafted per my intents, but I haven't looked at how they match together. My thought is that is what it would do. But Senator Newman, I'm open to suggestions if that's a concern, but the intention would be that we don't leave it open-ended for a call for a constitutional convention forever, because I've read articles, had input from constituents and people across the state and country actually that would have concerns that you just leave it open-ended no matter what the topic is you're asking for. And so that's the purpose of that.
Senator Newman.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, I think this is a pretty important question because I would certainly not want to unleash on the American people a new constitutional convention. That would be, frankly, one of the primary reasons why I would not be in favor of Senate File 17. But if the Western Amendment is removing that aspect of Senate File 17, i.e. the possibility of a constitutional convention in the future if Congress doesn't take action on the resolution, that would be an important piece of information for me to have in deciding what to do on this bill. And as I stand here right now, I'm a little unclear on that. So thank you, Madam President.
Senator Pratt. Is there further discussion on the A3 Westrom Amendment? Senator Westrom.
Madam President, clarification from staff. What I stated to Senator Newman is correct. It would set a date certain for the request for a constitutional convention. Senator Newman, to your question, what I told you is correct, but they affirmed that, and I wanted the body to know that. Madam President, just briefly, and to Senator Marty's comments, if gridlock is the outcome and a budget is not passed that spends our children's futures away now, that isn't a bad thing. If it stops Congress from continuing to borrow from China and all the other countries they borrow from to continue deficit spending, that is not a bad thing. The 3/5 majority actually gives Congress more wiggle room, and one could argue we shouldn't even ask them to include that language in a balanced budget amendment. That could be a topic of discussion. Granted, we are trying to give strong guidance to the Congress in passing a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution. They get to write the language ultimately, we don't. But the 3/5 for members that have concerns like Senator Marty is a reasonable approach to try to say, hey, if you are going to deficit spend, which we can't do here in Minnesota. We can't do it in Minnesota, not even with a 3/5 vote, Madam President. But this says 3/5 vote. At least you need to have that strong of a group of congressmen and women agreeing to borrow away our kids' future before you're going to have a budget that doesn't balance. A lot like we have to do with bonding bills in our state. But we don't have the flexibility of borrowing and deficit spending in our state. We have to come up with a plan. Now, arguably, that's tough decisions at times, but I think we all agree that Congress needs to rein in their fiscal house to preserve our state and our nation's future, and more so, preserve the future of our children and our grandchildren. Because we know we cannot continue on this same path of deficit spending and everybody saying, well, I don't have the will to balance the budget. I think we would have similar problems in this state legislature just because that's human nature if we didn't have a constitution that ultimately forbid us from deficit spending. We get real close to it at times when deficits occur, but ultimately we have to figure it out and we have to find ways, sometimes creative, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. Let's have Congress start acting the same way and pay as they go, not borrow away our children's future. I'd urge your support of this balanced budget amendment to Senator Marty's constitutional amendment proposal.
Further discussion. Senator Marty.
Madam President, very briefly, Senator Westrom, if this is a good idea, I'd encourage you to bring it through the committee process. Again, I've heard most of the people I hear from are frustrated that the supermajority of the filibuster in the U.S. Senate is gridlock. That's not saying your idea might not have some merit, but I'd encourage you to bring it through the committee process instead of tacking it onto here, and urge you to reject the bill amendment.
Further discussion on the A3 amendment. Senator Westrom.
Madam President, would Senator Marty yield for a couple of questions?
Senator Marty, do you yield?
Madam President, Senator Marty, two questions. I'll ask the first one. The 3/5, is your concern that that would be similar to the filibuster rule and you would rather not give Congress that option, just tell them directly they should have a balanced budget, no option to deficit spend, like similar to what we have to do here in Minnesota? Would that be more palatable to you? Whether it's today or whether it's in a future bill, I would just like to get your thoughts and comments on that. And then I have a follow-up question.
Senator Westrom, you have to be seated so that I can see Senator Marty. Senator Marty.
Madam President, Senator Westrom, I don't think we've had a federal budget for any given year that was created surplus and helped pay down the debt since President Clinton. I think that the federal government's budgeting problems have been very great, and I don't think we're going to see with the divisions in the Congress right now any changes in the immediate future on this. I'd encourage you to bring your proposal to committee if you think it's got merit.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, Senator Marty, on the provision that Senator Newman talked about, if this amendment doesn't fail, are you potentially open to at least putting a date certain for revocation of our request for a constitutional convention? And I ask that with the concern that leaving it open-ended, as I've read up on it and understand, Congress could potentially call a constitutional convention for banning something else or doing something else completely related to the request you're asking, and I don't know if that's your intention. So would the second part of this amendment be something of interest and you'd be willing to consider depending upon the fate of this amendment?
Senator Westrom, you have to be seated. Senator Marty.
Madam President, Senator Westrom, I think the point I want to make it clear is there's no intent to have a constitutional convention here. The whole point is that the way our bill is drafted is that Congress, if there were states that were pushing, if enough states were pushing that it might become possible to force Congress's hand, they would be given 6 months to do this themselves, so they wouldn't have to have a constitutional convention. And I will guarantee you there are members of neither the Democratic nor Republican parties in Congress that want a constitutional convention. This would simply force their hand to act and propose a constitutional amendment on their own. And the analogy I'll give to that is how it happened once before, where a number of states petitioned, I believed it was 20-some states petitioned for direct election of U.S. senators 100 years ago, and Congress, seeing this happening, decided to propose a constitutional amendment on its own. And that's realistically what would happen here. There's nobody in either party of Congress who wants a constitutional convention. This is the only way we can force their hand to do one on their own.
Further discussion of the A3 amendment. Senator Westrom.
Well, Madam President, I don't want to belabor this, but just to be clear, Senator Marty hasn't said anything that contradicts that. There might be others here that have insight on this issue. But Senator Marty, I think to leave this open-ended for 10 or 20 years is a bit of a risky proposition, and I think it would be better to have some date certain, whether 4 years is right or 6 years is right. As I said, the concern is when we can pass a resolution like this stating this is an issue we want them to take up if they don't do it by amendment ratification. It doesn't require them or limit the Constitutional Convention to just this topic. In fact, there's nothing that compels them to even bring this topic up. And so my concern would be is we give them an open-ended call for a Constitutional Convention with no such limitation or time of revocation or limitation of what they're going to bring up or discuss if they were to ever amend our Constitution. And that becomes the risky proposition. We all could come up with ideas that may or may not be good discussion points for a Constitutional Convention. Hence, the reason I think one never has been called, and the reason most of us would be fearful of one ever being called. And so I would just say it would be a reasonable caution to at least set a date that doesn't leave this request open-ended, because 10 years from now they could use this as a basis to call a Constitutional Convention and not deal with this issue at all. And so that would be my concern, Madam President. Members, I'd urge your support of this amendment to deal with that matter as well.
Further discussion of the A3 amendment. Seeing none, the Secretary will take the roll on the A3 Westrom amendment. The Senate is under call. Senate is under call. Members will please vote. The Senate is under call. Members will please vote. All members who are not excused, having voted, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 24 ayes and 35 nays, the amendment is not adopted. Further discussion of Senate File 17. Senator Westrom.
Madam President, I've asked Council to take just the June 1st, 2017 time limit language to add as an amendment. I understand they are just about ready to give it to you at the front desk, and so I just mentioned that before you go to third reading. I'd like to offer that amendment, but as soon as it's here, we can proceed. Madam President, I'm happy to talk about that first if you would indulge me, or if there's others that want to discuss this before we go to third reading, I defer to them.
Senator Westrom, we'll wait for your amendment. Is there further discussion on Senate File 17? Thank you, Senator Benson.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm looking at page 2, line 12. Nothing in this amendment shall be construed to abridge the freedom of the press. And if Senator Marty would answer a question for me.
Senator Marty, do you yield to a question? He does. Senator Benson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Marty, what if a large corporation decided to start publishing a newspaper? Would they be violating this or complying with your resolution?
Senator Marty.
Madam President, Senator Benson, lots of corporations do publish newspapers. A lot of them have been and will continue to. This would not have an impact on that. Period. I had a comment for Senator Westrom in a minute, but I'll sit down.
So, Madam President, if Senator Marty's completed his answer, my concern is a corporation could spend an abundance of money, as much as they wanted, to publish a newspaper expressing opinions, favoring a candidate, opposing a candidate, which puts us exactly back to where we are right now. And so for that reason, I will be opposing this resolution.
Senator Westrom, your amendment is ready. Secretary will report. A50 amendment.
Senator Westrom moves to amend Senate File number 17 as follows, page 2 after line 26, and this is the A50 amendment.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, members, to this amendment, it's related to the last discussion. While I think the balanced budget amendment added to this would vastly improve this bill, I think we can improve it by at least setting a timeline of how long we are authorizing Congress to call for a constitutional convention. I think it's only responsible, and Senator Marty, if 6 years is better than 4 or 3 is better than 4, I'm open to that discussion. We could easily change this date, but I don't think we want to leave an unintended consequence here of an open-ended call for a constitutional convention where Congress wouldn't be obligated to take this issue up or any other issue we send them. They would just be able to use our resolution as buy-in to them calling a constitutional convention, and I believe it's 3/4 of the states have to call it. And so it's only responsible that after a certain point we revisit this issue and not have a constitutional convention called for banning ag products or doing something else that we completely don't intend them to have them do by calling a constitutional convention. And my reading, the input many people have given me is a state just needs to call the convention, but you have no control over what is discussed, what topic it is limited to, or what topics they go to. And so I think it would be, for anybody concerned about that, it would be wise to at least set a date, and we can rediscuss this date 4 years, this issue 4 years down the road if we want to continue our call for a constitutional convention. But I think it would be very wise of us to set a limit on this call. And so I'd urge members to do that. If this bill is going to pass, it is a good way to limit the time. Thank you. I'd ask for a roll call, Madam President.
Further discussion of the A50 amendment, Senator Marty.
Madam President, Senator Westrom, two things. One, I do think you're misconstruing how the process works. This petition would be with other states making the same or very similar petition, not calling for a constitutional convention, but calling for Congress to take action to address the two specific concerns in the bill. However, I don't disagree with you about a timeline, and I will suggest that what has been set for ratification of certain amendments and other things related to the constitutional process in the past, some amendments Congress has passed have had open-ended timelines for ratification. The others have done 7 years, and I would suggest the year 2020, June 1st, 2020, I'd be happy to accept the amendment if you thought that period was appropriate, because I'm not disagreeing with you on that. I think a reasonable period of time, and 7 was the number of years that was used for other constitutional amendment purposes.
Further discussion. Senator Westrom.
Madam President, I'm happy to make that oral amendment to my amendment if that's the correct process.
Senator
you give me
Westrom
guidance.
moves to amend the A50 amendment by striking on line 1.4, 2017, and inserting 2020. Secretary have that amendment? Discussion on the amendment to the amendment.
Madam President, I support the amendment.
The Secretary needs to report it as well. Secretary will report the amendment to the amendment.
Senator Westrom moves to amend the A50 amendment as follows. Page 1, line 4, strike or delete 2017 and insert 2020.
Senator Marty.
Madam President, I support the amendment.
All those in favor of the amendment to the amendment, please say aye. Opposed, no. Motion prevails and the amendment to the amendment is adopted. We now have the A50 amendment as amended before us. Senator Westrom.
Madam President, given that and the author's support, I would withdraw my request for a roll call.
Roll call request has been withdrawn. Further discussion, seeing none, all those in favor of the A50 amendment, please say aye. Opposed, no. Motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. We now have Senate File 17 as amended before us. Further discussion of Senate File 17. Seeing none, Secretary will give Senate File 17 its third reading.
Senate File Number 17, a joint resolution requesting that Congress propose a constitutional amendment, and if Congress does not propose an amendment, applying to Congress to call a constitutional convention.
Further discussion? The Secretary will take the roll on Senate File 17. Senate is under call. Members will please vote.
Senate is under call. All members having voted that desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 36 ayes and 24 nays, the bill is passed and the resolution is passed and its title agreed to.